Chapter 1, A Different Neighborhood. When we moved in, Mom said the house was perfect. Well, technically, it wasn't just our house. There were two. The one in the back where Mr. James and Mrs. Elsa lived, and the one in the front, which was going to be ours. I liked that the houses were so close together because it meant we were never really alone. Although, to be honest, at first I wasn't quite sure what to think about Mr. James and Mrs. Elsa. Mr. James was always quiet. He walked slowly like he had all the time in the world, and whenever he did something, he took his time step by step, as if it were a super important mission. He could spend hours watering the plants in the garden or fixing something in his woodworking shop, always with that serious face that was a little intimidating, but not too much. Mrs. Elsa, on the other hand, was like a storm of laughter. The moment she started talking, she would burst into laughter that echoed through the whole neighborhood. But there was one problem. I didn't understand a single word she said. Not one. Sometimes Mom and Dad would talk to her, and I would just stand there watching. Dad always had this look on his face, like, what did she just say? But he would just nod up and down as if he totally understood. Oh, of course, Mrs. Elsa, he'd say, trying to guess whether she was telling a joke, a story, or just laughing for no reason. One day, Dad finally worked up the courage to ask, "Sorry, could you repeat that last part?" And she, still laughing, said something like, "Oh boy, if you didn't get it the first time, you won't get it the second time either." There was a moment of silence, and then they both burst out laughing. Mom was braver. She would actually respond as if she had understood everything perfectly. But I knew that wasn't the case, because later, when we were alone, I'd ask her, "Mom, what did Mrs. Elsa say?" "No idea, son," she'd reply with a smile. Another time, Mom was talking to Mrs. Elsa in the yard, and I walked over, curious, trying to understand what they were saying. Then Mrs. Elsa turned to me and, laughing, said something that sounded like, "Oh, kid, you sure have a smart-looking face." I had no idea what to do, so I just looked at her and laughed too. Sometimes I think you don't really need to understand her. What matters is that she always makes you feel like you're exactly where you're supposed to be, like laughter is the official language of her house. And even though I thought Mr. James was boring at first, I later discovered he had an interesting side too, but that's another story.